The mud at Fort Laramie was not merely earth and water. It was a slurry of desperation, horse manure, and the shattered dreams of 100 wagon trains that had limped this far west only to realize they could go no further. The rain fell in, a relentless grey curtain, turning the world into a blurred watercolor painting where the only sharp edges were the cruelty of men. Lyra Crow knelt in the muck by the wheel of a heavy Conestoga wagon. Her hands, red and raw from the cold, were buried deep in the sleeves of her thin wool coat. She didn't look up. She couldn't. Her eyes, pale and clouded like milk glass, stared unseeingly at the ground she could smell. Wet straw, tobacco spit, and fear. She was 24, but she felt ancient. Scarlet fever had taken her sight at 6, leaving her in a world of shadows and sounds. She navigated by the scrape of boots on gravel, the scent of wood smoke, and the vibration of voices. Right now, the voice vibrating above her belonged to her step-uncle, Jebediah Crouch. "Useless baggage," Crouch snarled, his voice thick with whiskey and malice. He kicked the crate she was leaning against, sending a jolt through her spine. "We need to lighten the load for the pass. The oxen are struggling. We can't hold dead weight." Lyra shrank back, pressing herself against the rough wood of the wheel. "I can walk, Uncle," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can hold on to the tailgate. I won't burden the team." "Walk?" Crouch laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "You can't see the ruts. You'll break an ankle in a mile and we'll have to shoot you like a lame horse." He grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. He hauled her to her feet and dragged her into the center of the muddy yard where the other emigrants were gathered, haggling over supplies. "Attention!" Crouch bellowed, waving his free hand. "Attention, good people! Who needs a worker? Who needs a strong back?" The crowd turned. Men in oilskin coats, women with weary faces, children clinging to skirts. They looked at Lyra. They saw her wet hair plastered to her skull. They saw her clouded eyes staring at nothing. "She's blind, Crouch," a man called out from the porch of the trading post. "What use is a blind woman on the trail? She'll walk off a cliff." "She can cook," Crouch lied desperately. "She can mend. She has hands like a spider. She don't need light to work." "Does she eat?" Another man asked, spitting tobacco juice into a puddle. "Little as a bird," Crouch promised. Silence. The only sound was the rain hissing into the mud and the distant lowing of cattle. No one wanted a burden. The Oregon Trail was hard enough for the whole. Crouch felt the rejection. He felt the weight of her on his resources. He looked at the steep, dark peaks of the Rockies looming in the west. He knew the snows were coming. He shoved Lyra forward. She stumbled, falling to her knees in the slime. The cold wetness soaked through her dress instantly. "Fine," Crouch screamed, his voice cracking with rage. "Take her for free. I don't want a coin. Just take the blind one. Or so help me God, I leave her here for the wolves." Lyra gasped. She heard the murmur of the crowd. Shock, pity, but mostly relief that it wasn't their problem. She felt the vibration of footsteps backing away. "Please," she whispered to the mud. "Please, Uncle, don't leave me." "Shut up." Crouch raised his hand. He held a whip, a heavy bullwhip he used on the oxen. He raised it high, intending to drive her away like a stray dog. If you are liking this story, please subscribe. I know you must have subscribed by now, so let's continue. The whip cracked in the air, a practice swing that sounded like a pistol shot. Lyra flinched, curling into a ball, waiting for the bite of the leather. But the second crack never came. Instead, a new sound cut through the rain, click-clack. The distinct mechanical sound of a heavy revolver hammer being pulled back. "Drop it!" The voice didn't come from the crowd. It came from above. It was a voice like grinding stones, deep, resonant, and vibrating with a terrifying calm. Crouch froze. The whip hovered in midair. He looked up. Towering over the scene was a horse that looked like a monster, a massive Belgian draft horse, dark as iron, standing 17 hands high. Steam snorted from its nostrils in the cold air, and on its back sat a mountain. Gideon, the Iron Vein. He wore a coat made of bear fur that was so dark it seemed to absorb the light. His hat was pulled low, water dripping from the brim. His face was hidden in shadow and beard, but his eyes were visible. They were the color of gunmetal, and they were fixed on Crouch. In his right hand, resting casually on his thigh, was a Colt Dragoon, a horse pistol so large it could drop a buffalo. The muzzle was pointed directly at Crouch's chest. I said, "Drop." "Hit," Gideon repeated. The rumble of his voice was felt more than heard. Crouch swallowed hard. His bravado evaporated. "Now look here, stranger. This is family business. I'm just lightening the load." "By whipping a blind woman?" Gideon asked. His tone didn't change. It was flat, deadly. "She's dead weight," Crouch whined, lowering the whip slowly. "She can't see. She'll die on the pass." "She'll die here if you have your way," Gideon growled. He nudged the massive horse forward. The crowd parted instantly, terrified of the beast and the man. Gideon stopped the horse right next to Lyra. He looked down at her. He saw the way she shivered. He saw her hands, red and muddy, clutching her skirts. He saw her eyes, clouded, unseeing, yet wide with terror. He felt a pang in his chest, a rare emotion for a man who lived alone above the timberline. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. He knew what it was like to be discarded, to be seen as broken. "Stand up, girl," Gideon said. His voice softened, just a fraction. Lyra lifted her head. She heard the voice. It was deep, like the sound of the wind in the canyon. It was scary, yes, but it wasn't cruel. I can't see you, sir," she whispered. "I can see you," Gideon replied. "Stand up." Trembling, Lyra pushed herself out of the mud. She stood there, swaying, looking small and fragile. Next to the colossal horse, Gideon holstered his gun. He reached down. His hand was enormous, wrapped in a rough leather glove. He grabbed her arm. Lyra flinched, expecting pain. But his grip was firm, not crushing. It was an anchor. "Up," Gideon grunted. He swung her up behind him, as if she weighed. Nothing. She landed on the horse's broad rump, scrambling for purchase. "Hold the belt," Gideon commanded. Lyra reached around his massive waist. Her hands met the rough fur of his coat. He smelled of pine resin, wood smoke, and rain. He smelled of safety. Gideon turned his attention back to Crouch. He reached into his pocket. He pulled out a single gold coin, a Spanish doubloon he had found. Years ago, he flicked it into the mud at Crouch's feet. "For the burial," Gideon said darkly. "Burial?" Crouch stammered, looking at the gold. "Whose burial?" "Yours," Gideon said, "if I ever see you near her again." He didn't wait for an answer. He kicked the horse. The massive beast surged forward, its hooves churning the mud, carrying them out of the yard, past the staring crowd, and toward the dark, storm-shrouded peaks of the Rockies. Lyra buried her face in his coat, listening to the steady, thundering beat of his heart, wondering if she had been saved by an angel or claimed by a monster. The ascent into the Rockies was not a visual journey for Lyra Crow. It was a terrifying symphony of physics and temperature. The world she had known, the flat, muddy stench of the wagon depot, fell away, replaced by an aggressive, biting cold that seemed to hunt for the gaps in her threadbare coat. She clung to the belt of the stranger, Gideon Vane, with hands that had lost all sensation hours ago. The massive draft horse beneath them moved with a rhythmic, tectonic power, its hooves striking stone with a sharp clack-clack that echoed off canyon, walls she could feel pressing in on them. The wind changed its voice as they climbed. In the valley, it had been a wet, miserable hiss. Up here, above the timberline, it was a scream, a high, thin wail that tore at her ears and snatched the breath from her lungs before she could fully inhale. She buried her face in the fur of Gideon's coat. It smelled of deep, resinous pine, old wood smoke, and the metallic tang of a gun that had been fired recently. It was a harsh scent, devoid of softness. but it was the only anchor she had in a void of swirling wind and terrifying drops. She could feel the horse shifting its weight, leaning into turns that she sensed hung over infinite emptiness. Every time a hoof slipped on the shale, a sickening scritch of stone on stone, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Easy," Gideon rumbled. The sound traveled through his chest and into her cheek, a deep vibration that felt more solid than the ground. He wasn't talking to her. He was talking to the horse. Hours bled into a frozen eternity. Just when Lyra thought her mind would shatter from the sensory overload of the cold and the wind abruptly died. They had entered a sheltered draw. The air grew still, heavy with the scent of spruce and damp earth. "Down," Gideon grunted. The horse stopped. Lyra felt the sudden absence of motion. She sat frozen, her limbs stiff as firewood. Large hands, rough as bark but surprisingly sure, grabbed her by the waist. Gideon didn't ask if she was ready. He simply lifted her. For a second she was weightless, suspended in the cold air, before her boots hit the ground. Her legs buckled. She couldn't feel her feet. She collapsed into the snow, the shock of the cold powder biting through her skirts. "Stand," Gideon commanded. His voice was not cruel, but it held the impatient weight of a man unused to slowing down. "If you sit in the snow, the mountain keeps you." Lyra scrambled up, reaching out blindly. Her hand struck the rough, frozen logs of a wall. Gideon opened a door. The sound of heavy iron hinges groaning filled the silence. "In." He ushered her inside. The transition was violent. One moment she was in a freezer, the next she was enveloped in a thick, dry heat that smelled of curing. Leather, rendered fat, and dust. The air was still, profound in its quiet. The door slammed shut behind them, the heavy thud of a wooden bar dropping into place, sealing them in. "Stay," Gideon said. Lyra stood by the door, dripping onto the floorboards. She heard him moving, heavy, deliberate steps. The sound of a match being struck, the hiss of a lantern flaring to life, then the crackle of new wood being thrown onto a fire. "This is the cabin," Gideon said, his voice echoing slightly in the small space. "It is small, it is warm, and it is dangerous if you are a fool." He walked back to her. She could feel the heat radiating from him. "Listen to me," he rumbled. 3 steps from the door is the wood stove. It burns hot enough to take the skin off your hand. 10 steps from the door, straight out, is the cliff edge. There is no rail. If you wander out at night, you fall 2,000 feet. Lyra swallowed, hard, nodding. "I understand, sir." "Gideon," he corrected sharply. "I am no sir. I am a trapper, and I bought you because Crouch was going to kill you, not because I need a guest." He grabbed her arm and guided her to a rough bench. "Sit. Dry. Off. I have to see to the horse." And then he was gone. The door opened and closed, bringing a brief gust of winter before sealing her back in the silence. Lyra sat for a long time, shivering as the heat of the fire began to penetrate her soaked clothes. The silence of the cabin was not empty to her. It was full of information. She listened. The fire popped, spruce wood, sappy and hot. The walls creaked as the wind outside buffeted the logs. Somewhere in the corner, a mouse scratched at the floorboards. "He thinks I am helpless," she thought. "He thinks he has brought a child to his mountain." She reached out. Her fingers brushed the rough wood of the bench. She traced the grain. She stood up, her legs trembling but holding. She began to map the room. She moved with her hands outstretched. Her movements fluid and cautious, like a cat in a new territory. She found the table. Heavy, scarred oak, sticky with something that smelled like molasses. She found the bed, a pile of furs in the corner that smelled of him. She found the larder. It was a disaster. Gideon Vane might be a king of the mountains, but he lived like a bear. Her hands moved over sacks of flour that were open and spilling. She found a jar of dried beans that had been knocked over, the pulses scattered across the shelf. She found a side of bacon that was hanging precariously from a nail, dripping grease. onto a pile of clean shirts. Chaos, she whispered. He lives in chaos. She couldn't see the mess, but she could feel the neglect. And in that neglect, she found her footing. She wasn't a burden here. She was a necessity. She set to work. She couldn't see the dirt, but she could feel the grit on the table. She found a bucket of water and a rag. She scrubbed until the wood felt smooth and clean under her fingertips. She organized the larder by smell and shape. Flour in the sack, beans in the jar, bacon hung securely. Then her hands found his clothes. They were thrown in a heap on a chair. She picked up a shirt. It was heavy flannel. Her fingers traced the fabric, finding a long, jagged tear in the sleeve. He walks through thorns, she murmured. She found a sewing kit in a tin box on the mantel, the rattle of the needle and thread. Giving it away. She sat by the fire. Threading a needle without sight was a feat of patience and agony. She licked the thread, feeling the tip with her tongue. She held the needle, guiding the thread by the vibration of the air and the sheer sensitivity of her calloused fingertips. She pricked herself, once, twice. A drop of blood welled up, hot and metallic. She ignored it. She found the eye. She pulled the thread through. She began to stitch. Her stitches weren't pretty, perhaps, but they were tight. She felt the fabric pull together, the tear closing under her ministrations. While she worked, she smelled the air. The fire was dying down. She stood up, navigated to the woodpile by the stove, 3 steps, just as he said, and fed the fire. She found a pot. She found the dried venison and the onions she had organized. She started a stew. She cut the onions by feel, the sharp scent making her blind eyes water even more. She crumbled the dried sage she found hanging from the rafters. She listened to the water boil, a low, rhythmic bubbling that sounded like a heartbeat. Hours passed. The cabin filled with the scent of savory meat and herbs, masking the smell of dust and bachelorhood. The door latch clicked. Lyra froze, the needle still in her hand. Gideon stepped inside. He stopped. He didn't stomp the snow off his boots. He just stood there. The cabin didn't smell like cold ash and stale grease anymore. It smelled like food. It smelled like a home. He looked at the table. It was scrubbed clean, the wood gleaming in the firelight. He looked at the larder. The shelves were orderly. He looked at Lyra. She was sitting on the bench, his flannel shirt in her lap. She looked small, her face pale, her eyes staring fixedly at a point just over his left shoulder. "You're not sitting," he said, his voice rough. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of confusion. "I can't sit for long, Gideon," she said softly, using his name as he had instructed. "My hands get restless." Gideon walked further into the room. He saw the pot bubbling on the stove. He walked to the bench and picked up the shirt from her lap. He ran his thumb over the sleeve. He felt the stitches. They were small, tight, and incredibly strong. He looked at her finger, seeing the small dot of dried blood where the needle had bitten her. He looked at her face. The cloudiness in her eyes was real. She hadn't seen the tear. She had felt it. "I told you the cliff was 10 steps away," Gideon grumbled, tossing the shirt onto the bed. "I didn't tell you where the thread was." "I found it," Lyra said simply. "I listened to the house." Gideon walked to the stove. He lifted the lid of the pot. The steam hit his face, rich and oniony. His stomach rumbled, a loud, treacherous sound in the quiet room. He hadn't eaten a hot meal that he hadn't cooked himself. In 5 years, he grabbed a ladle and 2 tin bowls. He poured the stew. He walked to the table and set a bowl down in front of her. He guided her hand to the spoon. "Eat," he commanded, sitting heavily across from her. He took a bite. It was good. Better than good. It tasted like care. He watched. Her eat, her movements careful but precise. She didn't spill. She found her mouth with the spoon perfectly, guided by the heat of the steam. "You aren't dead weight," Gideon said suddenly, the words tumbling out of his beard before he could stop them. Lyra paused, her spoon hovering. She turned her face toward his voice. "No, Gideon," she whispered. "I'm just blind. There is a difference." Gideon grunted, scraping his bowl. He watched the firelight dance in her unseeing eyes, and for the first time, the iron vein felt a crack in his armor. He had brought a stray dog home to keep it from dying, but the dog had just cleaned his house and fed him. The friction of his solitary life was grinding against the reality of her presence, and to his terrified surprise, he didn't hate it. He feared it, because reliance was a trap, and Gideon Vane had spent a lifetime avoiding traps. The blizzard that hammered the high peaks 3 days later did not arrive with a howl. It arrived with a suffocating heavy silence that pressed against the eardrums like deep water. The wind, which had been stripping the needles from the pines for 2 days, abruptly died. The temperature plummeted until the logs of the cabin groaned and popped like rifle shots as the sap froze deep within the wood. Gideon had been restless all day. He had paced the small floor, checking the bar on the door, checking the shutters. He moved with a heavy, dragging gait that Lyra, sitting by the fire mending a tear in his spare shirt, tracked with her ears. Scuff, drag, pause, wheeze. "Gideon?" she asked, her needle pausing in midair. "Your breathing catches." "Cold air," Gideon grunted, turning away from her. "Just the frost in the lungs. Happens every winter." But it wasn't just the frost. Lyra could hear the fluid rattling deep in his chest, a wet, heavy sound like stones rolling in a riverbed. She could smell the change in him, the sharp, metallic tang of fever sweat cutting through the scent of wood smoke and pine. He grabbed the water bucket. "I'll fetch snow to melt," he rasped. He reached for the door latch. He missed. His hand swiped clumsily at the wood. He swayed like a great pine whose roots had finally snapped in a gale. "Gideon!" Lyra dropped the shirt. He didn't answer. His knees buckled. The impact of his body hitting the floor shook the entire cabin. The water bucket clattered away, rolling into the shadows. Lyra was off the bench in a heartbeat. She didn't need eyes to find him. The sound of his fall was a map. She dropped to her knees, crawling across the rough planks until her hands found the heavy wool of his coat. He was burning. Even through the thick fur, the heat radiating from him was terrifying. It was a dry, consuming fire. She touched his face. His skin was parchment dry and scorching hot. His breath came in shallow, desperate hitches, whistling through a throat constricted by inflammation. "No," Lyra whispered, panic fluttering in, her chest like a trapped moth. "Not now, not in the storm." She tried to lift him. It was impossible. He was a mountain of muscle and bone, dead weight in his unconsciousness. She couldn't drag him to the bed. She would have to nurse him right. There on the floor, in the drafty space between the door and the hearth, she scrambled to the bed, pulling the heavy buffalo robes and furs off the frame. She dragged them back to him, covering him, tucking the edges under his shivering body to trap the heat. "Gideon," she said, slapping his cheek lightly. "Wake up. You have to drink." He groaned, thrashing his head from side to side. "The trap," he mumbled, his voice thick and delirious. "Iron. Legs caught. Don't let the wolves." Lyra froze. He wasn't here. He was trapped in some memory of pain and snow. "Shh," she soothed, lifting his heavy head into her lap. "No wolves here, just Lyra, just the fire." For 3 days and 3 nights, the storm raged outside, burying the cabin in a tomb of white. While inside, Lyra fought a war against the fever. The blindness that the world called a curse became her greatest weapon. In the dim, windowless hours of the storm, sight was useless. A sighted woman might have panicked at the darkness, at the shadows flickering on the walls. But Lyra lived in the dark. She knew the dark. She navigated the cabin by memory and touch. She found the dried mustard powder in the tin on the top shelf, smelling it to be sure. She found the jar of rendered bear grease. She mixed a poultice in a wooden bowl, the pungent fumes making her eyes water, but her hands never shaking. She applied the paste to his chest, her fingers moving over the scars that mapped his torso. Jagged. Ridges of old knife fights, the pucker of a bullet wound, the long smooth burn of a rope. She learned the geography of his violence with her fingertips. She bathed his forehead with cool snowmelt she gathered by cracking the door just an inch, flinching as the wind tried to tear the latch from her grip. She held him down when the fever. Dreams made him thrash and fight invisible enemies. "Easy, Iron," she whispered, using the name she had heard men call him. "You are safe. The door is barred." She listened to his heart. It was the only clock she had. Thump, 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 thump. Fast, too fast, like a bird flying into a window pane. She sang to him, low, mournful Irish ballads she remembered from a mother she hadn't seen in 20 years. The vibration of her voice against his chest seemed to soothe him, anchoring him to the room when his mind tried to drift away into the whiteout. On the fourth morning, the wind died. The silence that followed was heavy and profound. The air in the cabin was still. Lyra was asleep, her head resting on her knees, sitting on the floor beside his pallet of furs. Her hand was resting on his chest, an unconscious monitor of his life. She woke to a change in the rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. Slower, stronger, she lifted her head. She held her breath, listening. The rattle in his chest was gone. His breathing was deep and quiet. "Gideon," she whispered. There was a rustle of furs. "You're singing," a voice rasped. It was a wreck of a voice, like gravel grinding on glass, but it was lucid. "I stopped singing hours ago," Lyra said softly, reaching out to touch his forehead. Her cool hand met his skin. The fire was gone. He was damp with the sweat of the breaking fever, but he was cool. Gideon didn't pull away. He lay there, weak as a newborn kitten, staring up at the ceiling beams he couldn't quite focus on. He felt the small, calloused hand on his face. He turned his head. Lyra was sitting there, her eyes staring sightlessly at his chin. She looked exhausted. Her hair had come loose from its braid, framing her face in a dark halo. There were dark circles under her clouded eyes. "You stayed," Gideon whispered. The realization hit him harder than the fever. He had expected to die alone. He had lived alone. He assumed he would die that way. "Where would I go?" Lyra asked, a small, tired smile, touching her lips. "The door is barred, and the cliff is 10 steps away." Gideon let out a breath that might have been a laugh if he had the strength. I thought I was in the trap again, the one that took my brother." Lyra's hand stilled on his face. "Your brother?" "Long time ago," Gideon murmured, his defenses stripped away by the weakness. "We were green. Came up too early. The snow took him. I couldn't lift the log." He closed his eyes. "I thought you were him, but your hands were soft." Lyra moved her hand from his forehead to his cheek. She traced the line of his jaw, buried under the thick beard. She felt the tension there, the iron control he usually maintained, now slack with exhaustion. "I am not your brother," she whispered, "and I am not a ghost." "No," Gideon agreed. He opened his eyes and looked at her. Really looked at her. "You are a witch. You navigated this house in the dark. You found the mustard. You kept the fire. I see with my hands, Gideon," she said. "I see with my ears. The darkness is my home. You were just visiting it." She hesitated, her fingers hovering over his cheekbone. "May I?" she asked. Gideon knew what she wanted. She wanted to see him. The way she saw the world, he had never let anyone touch his face. He was scarred. He was ugly. He was the iron. But he was too weak to stop her. And God help him, he didn't want to. "Go ahead," he rasped. Lyra's fingertips touched his temples. They were light as moth wings. She traced the ridge of his brow. She felt the deep furrow between his eyes, the mark of a man who squinted against the sun and the pain. She moved down. She traced the bridge of his nose, broken once, crooked now. She traced the high cheekbones. Then, her fingers found the scars. There was a long, thin line running from his ear to his jaw, a knife slash. There was a pucker of tissue near his eye. Gideon held his breath. He waited for her to flinch, to pull away in disgust. She didn't. Her fingers lingered on the scars, reading them like braille. "You have a hard face," she whispered, "like the rock outside." "Ugly," Gideon corrected harshly. "No," Lyra said. She moved her thumbs to the corners of his mouth. "Strong. Whatever did this, you survived it. Maps aren't ugly, Gideon. They just show where you've been." Gideon felt a lump form in his throat, a painful, expanding pressure that had nothing to do with the fever. To be known, really known, without being seen, was a terrifying intimacy. He reached up. His massive hand engulfed hers, pressing it tighter against his face. "What do you see?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "I see a man who carries the mountain," Lyra said softly. "But he is tired of carrying it alone." Gideon closed his eyes, leaning into her palm. "Tell me what you hear." "I hear the wind," Lyra said. "It's changed. It's coming from the south now. The thaw is starting. I hear the timbers settling. I hear the mouse in the corner. He's bold. He thinks we're asleep. And I hear your heart. It's slow. It's strong." "Tell me what you see," she whispered back. Gideon looked at her. He looked at the way the firelight caught the gray in her eyes. He looked at the cabin, his prison, his fortress, which was now filled with the smell of herbs and the sound of her voice. "I see," he swallowed. "I see the sun hitting the peak across the valley. It's pink, like a rose. The snow is diamond dust. The sky is so blue it hurts. And inside," he looked at her hand in his. "Inside I see the only thing that isn't cold." The silence that stretched between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was a bridge. Gideon Vane, the man of iron, realized with a jolt of terror that the fever had burned away his walls. He was exposed, and the blind woman holding his face held the power to crush him or save him. "You stay," he whispered, a command that sounded like a plea. "You stay until the snow melts, and then we'll see." "I'm not going anywhere, Gideon," Lyra said, stroking his thumb with hers. "I can't find the door without you. It was a lie. They both knew it. She could find the door. She just didn't want to open it. Which country are you watching this video from? Please let me know in the comments below." The thaw did not arrive with a whisper. It arrived with the violent, cracking groan of the earth waking up. The silence of the deep winter was shattered by the roar of the creek, swollen with meltwater and black mud, tearing through the ravine below the cabin like a gouge in the mountain. The icicles that had hung like daggers from the eaves lost their grip, crashing onto the porch with the sound of shattering glass. Inside the cabin, the air had changed. It was no longer the stale, recycled breath of two people trapped in a wooden lung. It was heavy with moisture, smelling of wet wool, damp earth, and the sharp green scent of pine resin warming in the sun. Gideon Vane stood by the window, cleaning, his Colt Dragoon. Click, clack, slide. The heavy steel parts moved with a fluid grace in his hands. He was fully recovered from the fever. His strength returned twofold, but the scar on his face seemed deeper in the spring light, a map of worry. Lyra was at the table, kneading dough. Her hands moved rhythmically, but her head was tilted, her ear cocked toward the door. She stopped. Her hands hovered over the flour. "Gideon," she whispered. Gideon paused. "What is it?" "The creek." "No," Lyra said, her voice tight. "Not water. Iron." She turned her face toward the window he was blocking. "Shod hooves," she said. "Heavy and jingling. Spurs." Gideon swore softly. He peered through the crack in the shutter. Down in the muddy, Yard, emerging from the tree line like wraiths of dirty smoke, were 5 riders. They were picking their way up the treacherous, slushy path. Leading them, riding a mule that looked as mean as its master, was Jebediah Crouch. He looked older, harder. His coat was stained with tobacco juice, and his eyes scanned the cabin with a mixture of greed and fear. Flanking him were 4 men who wore their guns low and their morals lower, hired killers from the railhead. "He came back," Gideon growled, the vibration of his voice rattling the window pane. "The devil came back for his burial coin." "He doesn't want the coin," Lyra said, wiping her hands on her apron. "He wants the gold. He thinks you have a mine up here." "I have lead," Gideon said, chambering around. "He can have that." "Vane." Crouch's voice echoed off the canyon walls, thin and reedy. "Gideon Vane, I know you're in there. And I know you have my niece." Gideon didn't answer. He motioned for Lyra to get down. She crouched behind the heavy oak table, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Send her out," Crouch screamed. "And the box under your floor, we know about. The fur gold. Give us the girl and the dust, and we ride. You ride to hell," Gideon roared back. He raised the dragoon. He didn't aim for the men. He aimed for the rock face above them, hoping to start a slide to scare them off. Boom! The heavy pistol roared. Stone shattered above the riders, showering them with debris. It was a mistake. They didn't scare. They scattered. "Kill him!" Crouch shrieked. "Burn him out! Get the gold!" The world disintegrated. 5 rifles opened up at once. Bullets hammered the logs like hail. Wood splinters flew across the room, deadly as shrapnel. The window shutter, already weathered, disintegrated under a barrage of lead. A slug punched through a chink in the logs and slammed into the cast-iron skillet hanging by the fire with a deafening gong. Gideon dove to the floor, crawling toward his rifle rack. "Stay down, Lyra!" "I'm down!" she cried, pressing her face into the floorboards. She could smell the dust dancing in the air, shaken loose by the impacts. Gideon grabbed his Henry repeater. He rolled to his back and fired blindly through the window. "Bang, bang, bang! Flanking!" he shouted. "They're splitting up." He heard boots squelching in the mud on the south side of the cabin. He heard the heavy breathing of men hauling brush. "They're going to fire the roof," Gideon realized. Panic spiking in his chest, he stood up, intending to rush the back door. Crack! A bullet came through the window and struck the oil lamp hanging from the center rafter. The glass globe shattered. The oil reservoir exploded. It didn't catch fire. The oil was old, and the impact scattered it too thin. But the room was instantly plunged into twilight. The only light had been that lamp and the gray dusk outside. Now, with the shutters closed and the smoke filling the room, the cabin was a cave of shadows. Gideon blinked, his eyes struggling to adjust. The muzzle flashes from outside were blinding strobes, leaving purple spots in his vision. He was disoriented. He couldn't see the reload bag. He couldn't see the door latch. "I can't see!" Gideon roared, frustration and terror warring in his voice. "The smoke. It's too thick." He was a creature of sight. Without it, he was just a target. From under the table, a hand reached out. It grabbed his ankle. "Gideon!" Lyra's voice cut through the chaos. It wasn't terrified. It was calm. It was the voice of a woman in her own domain. "Get down," she commanded. Gideon dropped to his knees beside her. "I can't see them," he choked out. "I don't know where they are." "I do," Lyra whispered. She closed her eyes. She tuned out the ringing of the gunshots. She tuned out the roar of her own blood. She listened. The cabin was a drum, amplifying every vibration from the outside world. Scrape, squelch, thud. "Left wall," Lyra said sharply. 3 steps from the corner. Heavy boots. He's trying to pry the chinking. Gideon didn't question her. He raised the Henry. He aimed at the wall, 3 feet from the corner. Waist height, bang. A scream from outside. A body hitting the mud. "Got him," Gideon breathed, shock coloring his tone. "Reload," Lyra ordered. Her hands were already moving. She had crawled to the ammunition box. She couldn't see the cartridges, but she could feel them. Cool brass cylinders. She grabbed a handful. She reached for Gideon's empty dragoon. Her fingers danced over the cylinder, sliding the rounds home by touch, faster than he ever could have in the dark. Click, 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 click. She shoved the loaded gun into his hand. "Back door," she hissed, wood creaking, the hinges. "Require oil." "He's leaning on it." Gideon spun around. He leveled the heavy pistol at the back door. The latch lifted. The door swung open a crack. A shadow loomed there, a man with a sawed-off shotgun. Gideon didn't wait to see the face. He fired. Boom! The man was thrown backward off the porch as if yanked by a giant invisible hand. The shotgun discharged into the sky. "Right window!" Lyra screamed, pointing blindly into the gloom. "Glass crunching! He's climbing in!" Gideon swung the gun. A silhouette was halfway through the shattered window frame. Boom! The silhouette vanished, falling back into the yard with a wet thud. Gideon scrambled to the window, risking a glance. The yard was a mess of bodies and mud. "Crouch!" Gideon yelled. "Where is he?" He couldn't see the mule. He couldn't see the ringleader. Silence. Lyra whispered, "Wait!" The shooting stopped. The remaining men were regrouping, terrified of the demon in the dark cabin who seemed to see through walls. Lyra tilted her head. She pressed her ear to the floorboards. She heard it. Not boots, not hooves. Scratch. Hiss. "The roof," she whispered, her face going pale. "Gideon, the roof. Light steps. He's directly above the hearth." Gideon looked up. The roof was made of sod and heavy timbers. It was fireproof mostly. But there was one weak spot. The chimney. He's going to drop something down, Gideon realized. Dynamite or oil. He had seconds. He couldn't shoot through the stone chimney. He grabbed the water bucket, the one Lyra had filled that morning. "Cover the fire!" he shouted. He threw the water into the hearth. Hiss! A massive cloud of steam exploded from the stove, billowing out into the room, blinding and hot. At the same instant, a bundle dropped down the chimney. It landed in the wet. Steaming ashes. It sizzled. A fuse. Gideon didn't think. He dove. He grabbed the bundle, a cluster of dynamite sticks wrapped in oilcloth, with his bare hand. The fuse was sputtering, wet but still alive. He turned and threw it. Not out the door. Too far. Not out the window. Too small. He threw it into the root-cellar trapdoor that Lyra had left open to hide in. Down! He screamed, tackling Lyra and covering her body with his own. The dynamite fell into the deep earth cellar. Whump! The explosion was muffled, deep underground, but it lifted the floorboards 3 inches. The cabin groaned, dust raining down like snow. The shock wave rattled Gideon's teeth and left his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. But the logs held. The floor settled. Silence. Gideon lay on top of Lyra, breathing hard, the smell of cordite and wet ash choking him. "Lyra!" he gasped. "You hit?" "No," came a small voice from beneath him. "Are you?" "Just my ears," Gideon grunted. He rolled off her, sitting up in the dark, steam-filled room. He grabbed his dragoon. It was empty. He reached for his belt. Empty. "I need rounds," he said. Lyra sat up. She reached out and found his hand. She pressed 3 cartridges into his palm. "They've stopped," she whispered. "The horses are moving. They're pulling back." "Regrouping," Gideon said. "They'll come back with fire." "No," Lyra said. She stood up, her hand finding the edge of the table. "They think you're a ghost, Gideon. You shot them through the walls. You caught their dynamite." She turned her face toward him in the dark. "But Crouch isn't leaving. I can hear him. He's crying. He's cursing the mule." "He's mine," Gideon growled. He stood up, the rage finally overtaking the fear. He was done hiding. In the dark, he walked to the door. He unbarred it. "Stay here," he commanded. "Keep the Henry loaded." "Gideon," Lyra said. He stopped. "He breathes heavy on the left," she said softly. "He favors his right leg. Aim low." Gideon looked at her, a shadow in the shadows, the woman who had been his eyes when his own had failed. "I see him," Gideon promised. He kicked the door open and stepped out into the dying light, a vengeance forged in iron and guided by the blind. The twilight that hung over the Teton Range was a bruised purple, the color of a healing wound. The air outside the cabin smelled of sulfur and wet earth, sharp enough to sting the back of Gideon's throat as he stepped onto the porch. The yard was a graveyard of good intentions and bad men. The bodies of the hired guns lay where they had fallen in the mud, dark shapes rapidly being covered by the returning snow, but one shape was still moving. Jebediah Crouch was dragging himself toward his mule. He was breathing in wet, rattling gasps, his left leg dragging uselessly behind him, the leg Lyra had heard him favoring. He was fumbling with the saddlebags, desperate to mount, desperate to run. He heard the heavy thud of Gideon's boots on the wood. Crouch froze. He turned slowly, his face a mask of mud and terror. He saw the mountain man standing there, silhouetted against the dark interior of the cabin, the heavy dragoon pistol hanging at his side like an extension of his arm. "Vain," Crouch wheezed, raising a shaking hand. "Now, let's be reasonable. It was business, just business." Gideon didn't speak. He walked down the steps. The snow crunched under his boots, a sound Crouch flinched at. "I have money," Crouch stammered, his eyes darting to the gun. "I can pay for the trouble." "You already paid," Gideon rumbled, his voice low and vibrating with the memory of Lyra shivering in the rain. "You paid with her." Crouch's hand dipped toward his belt. It was a reflex, the last desperate gamble of a cornered rat. He went for the hidden derringer he kept in his vest. Gideon didn't hesitate. He didn't rush. He raised the dragoon with the terrifying calm of a man who had already accepted the outcome. Boom! The shot echoed off the canyon walls, rolling away like distant thunder. Crouch was thrown backward against the flank of his mule. He slid down into the mud, the derringer falling from his limp hand. He stared up at the sky, his eyes wide and unseeing, finally as blind as the niece he had tormented. Gideon stood over him for a long moment. He looked at the gold coin he had tossed in the mud months ago, the burial money. It was gone, spent on whiskey or greed. "Keep the change," Gideon whispered to the corpse. He turned and walked back to the cabin. Inside, the air was still thick with steam and the sharp scent of burnt lye from the chimney trap. Lyra was sitting on the floor where he had left her, huddled near the hearth. She was trembling, not with fear, but with the aftershocks of adrenaline. Her hands were pressed over her ears, blocking out the echo of the final shot. "Gideon?" she whispered, as the door latch clicked. "It's done," Gideon said. He barred the door, sealing out the cold and the dead. He walked to her. He knelt down, his knees cracking. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with anxiety. "My ears ring," Lyra said, lowering her hands. "And I think I cut my arm when you tackled me." Gideon looked. There was a long, shallow gash on her forearm, likely from a splinter of the floorboards, when the dynamite blew. Blood had soaked into the sleeve of her dress. "I need to clean it," Gideon said. He fetched the basin and the rag. He worked in silence, washing the blood away with a tenderness that belied the violence of the last hour. He bandaged the arm with strips of clean linen, his large, scarred hands moving with surgical precision. When he was finished, he didn't let go of her hand. He sat back on his heels, staring at the bandage. "You almost died," he choked out. "So did you," Lyra replied softly. "I am different," Gideon said, standing up abruptly and pacing away from her. "I am a target, Lyra. I am a man who attracts bullets. Today it was Crouch. Tomorrow it will be a bounty hunter, or a bear, or just the mountain itself trying to shake us off." He went to the loose stone in the hearth. He pulled out his cash, a heavy leather pouch filled with gold dust and silver. He placed it on the table with a heavy thud. "Pack your things," he ordered. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. Lyra stood up slowly, her head tilting. "Pack?" "The Thor is here," Gideon said, his voice hard and flat, trying to crush the hope in his own chest before it could kill him. "The pass to Denver is open. There are schools there, for the blind, places with brick walls and soft beds, places where Men don't throw dynamite down the chimney. He pushed the pouch toward the sound of her breathing. Take the gold. Take the horse. I'll ride you down to the railhead myself. You'll be safe there. You'll be free. Lyra stood frozen. She listened to the fire popping. She listened to the wind rattling the broken shutter. She listened to the ragged, terrified breathing of the man who was trying to send her away. She walked to the table. She found the pouch by the sound of the coins clinking inside. She picked it up. It was heavy. "You bought me for a coin," she said, quietly. "Now you want to sell me back for a bag of them?" "I am saving you," Gideon roared, slamming his hand against the wall. "Look at this place. It's a ruin. I am a ruin. You are a woman who knits and sings. You shouldn't be loading guns in the dark. You shouldn't be smelling blood in your own kitchen." He turned to her, pleading. "I can't watch you die, Lyra. I can't be the reason the light goes out of you completely." Lyra held the pouch for a moment longer. Then she walked to the door. She unbarred it. She opened it. The cold wind rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and the metallic tang of the battlefield. She stood on the threshold. "You're right," she said. "Out there, in the city, it is safer. There are sidewalks. There are rails." She turned back to face him. Her clouded eyes found him unerringly in the gloom. "But out there, Gideon, I am a cripple." She took a step back into the room. "Out there I am the blind girl. I am the burden. I am the thing people pity." She walked toward him, navigating the debris on the floor without stumbling. "But in here," she tapped her chest. "In here, when the lights went out. Who saw the enemy, Gideon?" Gideon went still. "Who heard the boots on the roof?" she asked, taking another step. "Who loaded the dragoon? Who told you where to aim?" She stopped right in front of him. She reached out and took his hand, the hand that had killed Crouch. "In this cabin, I am not blind," she whispered fiercely. "In this cabin, I am your eyes. I am useful. I am strong." She dropped the heavy bag of gold onto the floor. It hit the wood with a dull thud, ignored. "You want to send me to a soft place?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't want soft. Soft is where I rot. I want the iron, Gideon. I want the man who saw me in the mud and didn't look away." Gideon stared at her. He looked at the fierce set of her jaw. He looked at the bandage on her arm, a battle scar she wore like a medal. He realized then that he wasn't protecting her from the world. He was trying to protect himself from the terrifying reality that he needed her. He needed her darkness to understand his own light. "I am ugly," he whispered, the old insecurity rising one last time. "I am scarred. I am a beast who lives in a cave." Lyra reached up. Her hands found his face. Her thumbs traced the jagged line of the scar on his cheek, then moved to the rough hair of his beard. "I have never seen your scars, Gideon," she said, softly. "I only feel the man who holds the roof up." She went up on her toes, pulling his face down toward hers. "You are my sight," she whispered against his lips. "Don't ask me to go blind again." Gideon broke. A sob ripped out of his chest, a sound of surrender. He wrapped his massive arms around her, burying his face in her neck, holding her so tight he thought he might crush her, but she didn't pull away. She held him back, her strength matching his. "I won't," he choked out. "I won't let you go." He pulled back just enough to look at her. He saw the milky, pale eyes that saw nothing and everything. He knelt down. He took her hands and placed them on his face, covering his eyes with her palms. "Look at me," he whispered, a command that was also a prayer. "Look at me, Lyra, and never look away." Lyra smiled, a radiant, tear-filled expression that lit up the dark cabin better than any lamp. "I see you, Gideon Vane," she said. "I see you." He stood up and kissed her. It was a claiming, deep and desperate, tasting of smoke and survival. It was the seal on a covenant made in the dark, a promise that as long as they stood together, neither of them would ever be lost again. Epilogue. 1 year later. The summer sun in the Rockies was a brilliant, blinding white, reflecting off the granite peaks and turning the valley into a bowl of light. The cabin had changed. The shattered shutters had been replaced with sturdy new oak. A garden patch, fenced high against the deer, was blooming with hearty potatoes and herbs, mint, sage, and chamomile, organized by scent. On the porch, a rocking chair creaked rhythmically. Lyra sat in the sun. She wore a dress of soft yellow calico, the color of a dandelion. She was humming a low, sweet tune, her head tilted back to feel the warmth on her face. In her arms, wrapped in a blanket of soft doeskin, was a bundle, a baby boy. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's chin. The door opened. Gideon stepped out. He moved quietly now, the heavy stomp of the solitary trapper replaced by the careful tread of a father. He was shirtless, sweating from chopping wood, his scars silver in the sun. He walked to the chair. "He's asleep," Gideon whispered. "He's pretending," Lyra smiled, not opening her eyes. "His heart is beating fast. He smells the pine pitch on you." Gideon chuckled, a sound that came easily now. He knelt beside the chair. He reached out a massive finger. He touched the baby's cheek. The infant stirred, his tiny hand grasping Gideon's calloused finger. "Does he have my eyes?" Gideon asked, the old fear surfacing for just a second. Lyra shifted the baby, running her hand over the child's face, feeling the fluttering of his eyelashes. "He has eyes that see the hawk," she said softly. "And he has eyes that see the wind." She reached out and found Gideon's hand, interlacing her fingers with his. "But mostly," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder, "he has parents who see each other." Gideon kissed her hand, then the baby's head. He looked out at the valley, at the trail that wound down to the world of men, and then back at the woman who had turned his fortress into a home. He realized he didn't need to watch the trail anymore. The only world that mattered was right here, visible even in the dark. "Take the blind one free," he whispered to the wind, repeating the words that had started it all. He smiled, closing his eyes to listen to the rhythm of his family. "Best trade I ever made."